There we go.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. My grandmother had this wonderful cake. Oh, how the family loved it. It was a chocolate cake, and it was actually a 7-layer chocolate cake. For us kids, it was more like candy than a cake, and we certainly enjoyed it. I loved it, and my family all the time would ask my grandmother for the recipe, and my grandmother was so sweet, she would say with a nice smile, no. She had worked on this recipe for many years, and one day I finally asked her, I said, Grandma, why won't you give out the recipe? And she said, because I know people and I know them well, and well, people will want to change it, and this is my recipe. Well, before she passed, she actually wrote down the recipe and gave it to Karen. I don't know if it's because I'm the first son of the first son of the first son, I guess the patriarch of the family, but we still have it to this day in her handwriting. After she had passed away, I did give my cousins the recipe, and I would get feedback from them saying, it's just not the same. And I would ask them, well, what did you do? And someone would add, well, I added a little more chocolate, or I added a little bit more sugar, and I thought to myself, doggone, Grandma's right. People will try and change that recipe. But then there's one thing I know, and this was a great example of it. There are just some things, like Grandma's cake, that are best left alone in its originality. There's some things that are just good enough. That's how I actually see this particular gospel story today, the prodigal son. And I promise you I'll get chocolate cake and the sons put together. You can tell this story in so many different ways, and I've heard it in so many different ways. As a matter of fact, my colleagues were all texting this week talking about doing it in different ways. But I really thought to myself, the truth is, it is best heard in the original story. It can't be touched or altered, I think, to make it ever better than how Jesus did it. Instead, we should understand the original story, or I would say the original recipe of Jesus. We all know the story by heart, don't we? We all learned this from when we were a child, and I love this particular story. It's one of my favorites. And I bet everyone here can tell this classic story, or at least be pretty darn close to it. However, when we tell the story, we normally see the story in our own eyes, in our Western culture. But to truly understand it, I think we need to see the original recipe, the recipe of the Eastern culture as well. In other words, how the disciples would have heard this and understood it through their culture and their language. But first, let's look at the story itself. The story, of course, is about a man and 2 sons. And the reason Jesus is telling this story is that the clergy are a little upset with Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners, God forbid. And so the Pharisees, they said, are sitting there grumbling about it. So he said, let me tell you this story. The son wants to live his own life. He wants to go on his own terms. I always pictured it as a kid who wants to go to New York City. He's tired of the farm. He's tired of the same thing every day. He wants to see the world. He wants to see how other people live. And so he wants to be part of that life. And so he goes to his father. And he tells his father, give me what's mine. Give me my inheritance. And the father does this with great sadness, but he does give in to the child and gives it to him. The son goes off. He goes, after a few days, he goes to live his life, and apparently he's having a great time, according to his big brother. And he's having parties, and women, and dancing, and friends, and drinks, and every night it's a great big party. And he goes on and on for a while until there becomes a big problem. He runs out of money. I hate when that happens. The parties suddenly are gone. The fun is gone. The drinks are gone. The women are gone. And even his friends are gone. It kind of reminds me of the last part of The Great Gatsby. Remember in the book where all of a sudden, where's his friends? They're all gone when everything dries up. And suddenly, if that's not bad enough, a famine has hit. So you can imagine the food prices and everything flying up even higher. And now he is starving. He has hit rock bottom. It can't get any worse for him, he feels, until he finally finds a job. And that job is to feed pigs. So he goes out to a field to feed pigs. He's eating the pig's food, or at least he's trying to, but pigs are pigs. They don't exactly share their food. He's sleeping in the pig's mud. And again, he must have sat there and finally just sobbed, realizing he has nowhere else to go. He's hit what we call today rock bottom. Suddenly he is thinking about it. And the more he thinks about it, it says he comes to himself and he decides that he will go back home. He will go back home to his father and try to at least be one of his servants. He knows he can't be the son. He just wants to be a servant. And so he goes home carrying all on his shoulders his sin, his guilt, his broken ego, and most of all, his shame. He realizes asking to be a servant was probably more than he ever deserved or could hope for. But at least it was worth trying. It's how we are when we hit rock bottom and we have no more choices. Then there's the father. I've often imagined the father sitting out there and every day with a broken heart. Probably with torn clothes, because in Jewish culture, when someone has broken your heart and they have what you call died, you tear a piece of clothing, and I can imagine him there with his torn clothing, but every day looking out at the horizon. Looking just for hope. And guess what? Today he sees something. There is a dot out there, and that dot keeps getting bigger. You can imagine him squinting to see what it is. And suddenly he realizes it is his son. His man, this patriarch himself, lifts up his robe and he begins to run as fast as he can to his son. There he grabs his son, he embraces his son, he kisses him, and you can imagine the tears flowing down because his son is alive. His son tells him that he has sinned against heaven, and Dad, I've sinned against you. And he is correct, he has. He then asked his father, may I be one of your servants? Notice the father doesn't even answer him. Instead, his father calls for a party, a celebration. He calls his slaves and he gives his child the best robe in the house. He puts shoes on him and even a ring. And he's had the fatted calf slaughtered and cooked, for it's going to be a party. He invites the entire village, and they are beginning to sing and drink and have a wonderful time. And suddenly the brother, the older brother, has been out working all day, and as he's coming back to the house, he hears all of the celebration and calls the slave over and says, what's going on? The slave said, your brother is alive. Your father's celebrating. Come, be part of it. But the brother refuses. And so then we see the scene again of the father going out to the older son and telling him, come, please be with me, celebrate with me. But the son says, no. He tells his father, listen to me, I have worked like a slave my whole life, I've done everything you've ever asked, and you haven't even given me a little goat so that I can celebrate with my friends. I've always worked for you. And his father wants him to still come to it and says, son, listen to me. You've always been with me. We've never been separated. You don't know that pain. Your brother was dead, and now he's alive. Celebrate with me my celebration. And the son said, the older son said, no, and he won't do it. What a story. You see what I mean? It needs to be told in the original story, the original recipe. It's a strong story that Jesus is trying to tell to the Pharisees. What a story. One of my questions, and I have a few for you today, one of my questions is, whose side are you on? The older brother? The younger brother? The father? Who do you relate to? If you're like me, I'm the oldest son. And so I always have related to the oldest son in this. And now it's funny how I've talked to many of my friends, and it's always the firstborn who seem to go with the older son, because they're like, you know, I've always done everything my father's asked. I always follow the rules, but my brother and sister, they do anything they want. And it seems like they break all the rules, but not me. In our world, this sounds like a spoiled, selfish kid. Both of them, actually. But in the time of Jesus, this story is actually much more serious. Let's take a look. There's two views, as I said earlier. They're of seeing Jesus' story. There is the Western view, ours, and there's actually the Eastern view, and I'm not talking about just Jesus' day, I'm talking about today, in which I'm talking about Israel and the Middle East. In the Western view, what we see is a rotten, rude kid. And we see a spoiled son who only cares for himself. I think in our culture we see this quite often, don't we? Matter of fact, I guarantee if I asked you to make a list of at least 3 people in your family, I bet you could put them down who sound just like this kid. An older brother. There is an older brother who is angry for good reason. And like I said, in our culture, we could probably attach ourselves to him. However, there's also an Eastern view, like I said, the Middle East. The view that the disciples would have understood that is different than ours, a view that the disciples would have seen would have been a broken relationship with God. Guess what? Both brothers. Let's take a look at that. The son asked for his inheritance. We're going to talk about the younger son first. He asked for his inheritance. First of all, it wasn't even his to receive. But instead, it is the older brother who would receive all of the property, the entire inheritance. You may say, well, that's wrong. That's not fair. But you have to understand their culture. Why? Because the older brother would be the next patriarch of the family. You see, the patriarch is not just head of the family. He is responsible for all the family. And I'm not talking about grandma and grandpa and aunt and uncle. I'm talking about cousins and distant cousins, basically your entire village. In other words, if something goes wrong with somebody, their home burns down, it is the patriarch who is there to help them rebuild. If suddenly their sheep were slaughtered, it is up to the patriarch to go and make it whole again. We've even seen scripture in which if a family member is brought into slavery, the patriarch goes and buys them and brings them back home. That's why the money goes to him, so that he can take care of the extended family. The son's request for this land and money would actually have weakened now the entire family. Half of it is gone. Half of the money and property is there, and so their status would have dropped. But here's the worst part. That by asking for the inheritance is the same thing in Eastern culture as telling your father to hurry up and die already. That's what it means. Dad, you're too old. Hurry up and die so I can get what I want. And this is appalling in Eastern culture. Because as a present patriarch, he has to die first before that property can be transferred to the next patriarch. The son is just living for himself. You talk about real selfishness. It's not just about him. It's about an entire village that is affected. He is indulging. The younger brother doesn't care for the entire family. He only cares for himself. And when we find ourselves being isolated only among ourselves in selfishness, many times we find ourselves working with the pigs. Think about that picture for a moment. Working with the pigs. Remember, the younger son is Jewish. This would be unkosher. He's not only living with the pigs, but he's trying to steal the pods so that he can try to eat this unclean food. This would be a Jewish picture of a place where one is totally alienated oneself from God. I'd even go so far as saying this may be a picture of hell itself. But what about the older brother? The one that I relate to, right? Many of you relate to. For the older brother, he has been with the father all this time. He has worked hard for the father. And obviously we see them representing the clergy of that time, the Pharisees. But now something's gone different. Now the older brother is also being selfish. Though he has been loyal to his father, he is now being disobedient to his father, who's telling him to come to the party. He is not listening to his father. The disciples would have finally seen that the older brother is now sinning against the father by breaking one of the 10 commandments. What is it? Honoring the father and mother. All the father wanted to do was celebrate. A son that to him had died had come back alive. Who here would not celebrate with a neighbor whose child has been missing for several months, whether it was the child's fault or not? For a child to come home to that child, our parents, their child is alive again. Who here would not celebrate if one of your neighbor's children were in an accident and had died, but they brought him back to life, even if it was the child's fault? We don't care. We would be celebrating, and that's what the Father wanted. You see, the Father wants one thing only. He wants His boys together. He wants them under His home. He wants to give them love, reconcile, forgive, and bring them all back into the family. That's what the Father does. So my next question is, what about our relationship? Are we home? Are we with the Father? Is it strong? Or do we feel sometimes we're just distant from God? Longing maybe someday to come home. Maybe when I'm older and I'm retired, I have less things to do. Right. I'll come back to the Father. Maybe we've been hungry, selfish, hurt, confused from things that have happened to us in our past that we can't seem to get over. Maybe it's the stubbornness, or maybe it's shame that may be keeping us away from coming home. Or maybe we haven't gone anywhere, but neither has our relationship with God. It's just stale, sitting, not wanting to go where God calls us. Maybe even begging us like the father does to the older son. And like the older brother, maybe in our relationship, we're refusing to go. In truth, I bet we have played those sons in our life. Somewhere along the line we all have. But during this time of Lent, it is a great season to start looking at ourselves and our relationship with God. If we see ourselves away from home, turn and head home. It is a great time to self-examine ourselves and find out what it is that is blocking us, what is holding us back from a Father who is waiting and staring out at the horizon for you. Whether you are in an unknown place in life, or maybe you're even in the pig's mud, hell itself, God is ready for you to come home. God is ready to reconcile with you and what has happened in your past. God is ready to love you again, for God always loves us. And if you're lost, God is there to find you. If you are, however, one of those that is lucky enough to be in a good place with God, a good relationship with God that is very strong and very beautiful, my next question is, are you ready then to play the role of the Father? Yes, that's another character in the story. After all, we're supposed to mimic Christ. We are supposed to be the representatives of God in this world. Are we ready to forgive others that are out there, even in our own families? Are we ready to wipe away the tears of our neighbors? Are we ready to show them love? Are we ready to invite people back home to the church? And if we do, are we ready to celebrate with them? For they are alive again. God's love is perfect. I will say that again. God's love is perfect. He showed that love on the cross and in the resurrection by bringing us all home. God's love is perfect. Sometimes we may want to change it. Sometimes we want to mess with it. Sometimes we want to make it our own, and sometimes we just want to hold it for ourselves. But you know what? Like Grandma's cake recipe and like the gospel story today, some things are just perfect the way they are. The Father and His love is perfect, and that perfect love is waiting